Hey YouTube, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're going to be talking about a series of murders that terrified the Chicago area in the 1980s, and later on the entire nation. This remains one of the most publicized and yet unsolved murders today. If you're new here, we upload videos weekly where we talk about anything crime related, with my added experience as a cop. If you like the sound of that, go ahead and like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you guys have any questions or suggestions, leave them below in the comments. I try my best to reply to everyone. So, let's get into it. This time, let's start with a quick background of Chicago at the time, leading into how all this started. The year is 1982. The Chicago metro area is bustling, with an ever-growing population of just over 7 million people. A beautiful city, with incredible buildings and sometimes harsh weather. The crime rate is high, with over 600 homicides that would take place this year alone. People are stressed over the economy and a rise in violent crime. Not too unfamiliar to life today in most cities, is it? And yet, an attack on the people would come on an area that was totally unexpected, and that would strike fear into the entire nation, changing regulations for medicine and food that are still in effect today. Think to yourselves, how often have you just gone to the store, buying a bottle of any medication, and taking it without thinking twice if it had been tampered with? It's a luxury that we all enjoy, and so once did the victims of our story. Perfectly safe, until one day it wasn't. September 28th. 12-year-old Mary Kellerman tells her mother and father about her sore throat and runny nose. Like any good parents, they give their child some medicine to ease the symptoms, in this case, a capsule of extra-strength Tylenol. Just hours later, Mary would lose her life. In an interview with the Chicago Tribune, Mary's father, Dennis Kellerman, would recount, "I heard her go into the bathroom. I heard the door close. Then I heard something drop. I went to the bathroom door. I called, 'Mary, are you okay?' There was no answer. I called again, 'Mary, are you okay?' There was still no answer. So I opened the bathroom door, and my little girl was on the floor unconscious. She was still in her pajamas. 911 would be called, and medics with the Elk Grove Village Fire Department arrive and attempt to bring Mary back. Anyone who works in or with emergency services knows just how serious we take treating children. Firefighter Richard Keyworth recalls the events of the day. One of the paramedics on the call with the Kellerman girl was Dave Spung. Dave was one of the best paramedics I had ever met. He threw everything in the drug box at this young lady, and nothing made a difference. They would transport Mary to the Alexian Brothers Medical Center, and after medical staff does everything they can, they would pronounce her dead at 9:56 a.m. Because of her young age and the circumstances around her death, Mary would be scheduled to undergo an autopsy. While police were investigating the death, no one initially paid attention to the fact that Mary had taken Tylenol just before, as it was one of the most commonly taken over-the-counter medicines on the market. The next to fall victim was Adam Janis. Adam had stayed home from work because he felt like he was getting a cold. He went to pick up his children from preschool and stopped at the Jewel, a grocery store in the area, to get some Tylenol. He came home and had some lunch before telling his family, "I'm going to take a Tylenol and lie down." Just a few minutes later, he came staggering into the kitchen and collapsed. Adam is rushed to Northwest Community Hospital's intensive care unit, where doctors Thomas Kim and staff make numerous attempts to resuscitate him. Dr. Kim recalls his life-saving efforts, stating, "Our first job is to resuscitate, and we couldn't even do that. His heart would just not start beating. I signed Adam out as a probable cardiac death. I was talking to his family, trying to explain, what had happened. It's hard even if you know the diagnosis. I was trying to tell them we didn't know why. Adam's wife, Teresa, was there. His parents were there, and a whole slew of other people. And they didn't go back to their home. They went back to Adam's house in Arlington Heights." Just hours later, at 3:45 p.m., yet another unexplained medical death would take place. Mary Reiner, 27, is at home in Winfield. She has recently given birth to her fourth child. Not feeling well, she takes some Tylenol and collapses. Mary is rushed to Central DuPage Hospital in Winfield, where despite the best efforts of medical staff, she is pronounced dead. Mary's husband, Ed Reiner, would give a brief statement about the day, stating, "We were together for a long time. She was an excellent mother. We had 4 children. The baby was just a week old. I came home right after she had fallen on the floor." Ed would end his statement with this, overcome by emotion. 3 lives were lost in just hours, and the cause was still completely unknown. But more deaths were yet to come. 5 p.m. Remember Adam Janis? Well, his entire family, still in complete shock and grief over his death, had gone back to his house to start making the funeral arrangements. While there, Adam's younger brother, Stanley Janis, had some chronic back pain, and he asked his wife, Teresa Janis, to get him some Tylenol. Family reported that they each took 2 Tylenol, first Stanley and then Teresa. And then, minutes later, Stanley collapsed, followed shortly by Teresa. In complete shock, the rest of the Janis family called 911. Charles Kramer, a lieutenant with the Arlington Heights Fire Department, responded. He would later recount his involvement to the Daily Herald, stating, "When I arrived at the house, there were cars and people everywhere. All 8 of my men were working, 4 on the man and 4 on the woman. Everything that would happen to the man happened to the woman a few minutes later. 5:30 p.m. Dr. Kim, just getting ready to leave work after his shift ends, is stopped by a nurse. He recalls, "As I was putting on my blue blazer to leave, around 5:30, a nurse told me they were bringing the Janus family back. And I said, well, it's probably the parents, because they were feeble and they might have been very upset. And the nurse said, no, it's his brother. I had been talking to this 6-foot healthy guy, and I said, well, what happened? Did he faint? And she said, they're doing CPR, and they're working on his wife too. That's when I knew something was wrong." Lieutenant Charles Kramer contacted a nurse that he knew, Nurse Jensen. The lieutenant told her that he was extremely worried, and told her about the earlier death of Adam Janus and now the 2 deaths from the same house, of the same family. Lieutenant Kramer was told to contact a public health official, and told Nurse Jensen she was the only one he knew. At this point, emergency services and medical staff are sounding the alarm. They are now aware something is going on, that these aren't just unfortunate and untimely deaths. They just don't know what. Deputy Medical Examiner Donahue was the next to be notified about the series of deaths. Donahue states, "At the time, I lived 2 blocks away from the medical examiner's office, and I just happened to come back to pick something up. I walked through the investigations area, and one of the guys said, 'Doctor, we've got something unusual going on. We had this family in Arlington Heights where one person died, and then the brother and sister-in-law came over, and now the brother is dead, and the sister-in-law is in very serious condition and not expected to live.'" An investigator with the Cook County Medical Examiner's Office, Nick Pichos, meets with Dr. Kim and tries to gain an understanding of what is happening to these people. Nick tells Dr. Kim that they need to go out to the Janus house and try to see what on earth could be there that's causing these deaths. Nick would take with him Nurse Jensen, and both would try to identify what they believe had to be a chemical contaminant of some kind. In just under 12 hours, 3 deaths have occurred, with another person clinging to life but expected to die as well. Only now are they able to start investigating what could possibly be causing this. But investigations take time, and unfortunately, this time would cost the lives of several others. 6:30 p.m. 31-year-old Mary McFarland tells her co-workers that she has a headache. Her brother Jack is also there, and tells investigators later that she went into the back room and took an unknown amount of Tylenol for her headache. Just like all the others, she would collapse just minutes later. John Milner, a commander for detectives at the Elmhurst Police Department, states that after arriving on scene and getting statements, they begin to believe that this was a result of a poisoning. However, everyone has yet to connect the dots on all these unexplained deaths. 8 p.m. Nick, Nurse Jensen, and officers arrive at the Janus house, expecting to see something obvious that could be causing all of this. However, the house appears in order, with nothing out of the ordinary. Nurse Jensen sees a shelf of over-the-counter medicines and goes to investigate. Nick was told by family that there is a metalworking station in the basement of the home, and that he was once told by someone else that sometimes cyanide is used in metalworking for polishing. As Nick investigates the basement, Jensen opens a bottle of Tylenol on the shelf and finds 6 capsules missing. Reasoning that the dose for an adult is 2 pills per person, with 3 dead, she concludes that the Tylenol must have something to do with everything going on, and takes the bottle back to the hospital. 9:30 p.m. Nurse Jensen, now back at the hospital, tells Dr. Kim and Nick that the Tylenol is responsible for the deaths, but is met with resistance at the idea. Dr. Kim was quoted as saying, "She said, maybe it's the Tylenol." And I thought, well, that's fine, but at the time, that was just someone saying that. I was very frustrated, and I was very desperate. How come I can't figure out what is wrong with these people? Meanwhile, Nick had heard about the suspicious death of Mary Kellerman, and hears that the paramedics took a bottle of Tylenol with them from the scene. Nick contacts police, who bring him that bottle. Back in his office, Dr. Kim is growing more and more frustrated with his inability to diagnose these people. Not knowing what else to do, in desperation, he sends blood samples from all the victims off to a lab to be tested for anything and everything. Back to Nick, who is now called Deputy Medical Examiner Donahue, informing him of the Tylenol bottles taken from the homes of Mary Kellerman and the Janus family. Both bottles have the same lot number, MC2880. Donahue tells Nick to open the bottles and smell them. Upon doing so, Nick tells Donahue that they both appear to be normal, but that they both smell strongly like almonds. Both Nick and Donahue utter the word at the same time: cyanide. Donahue would later remark that they're very lucky that Nick can smell cyanide, as apparently only half of the population is actually able to smell it. Donahue explains what cyanide is and why it's causing their deaths. Cyanide is a chemical asphyxiant. It blocks the utilization of oxygen by red blood cells. You can be in an atmosphere with plenty of oxygen, and you can breathe it in, but it doesn't get picked up by the red blood cells, and you asphyxiate. It causes brain damage and cardiac arrest. It happens very quickly. This is why life-saving measures were ineffective for all of the victims. At 1 a.m. on Thursday, September 30th, Dr. Kim gets the blood results back. The victim's blood contains anywhere from 100 or 1,000 times the amount of cyanide required to kill, an absolutely massive dose. At 3:15 a.m., after being worked on for hours by medical staff, Mary McFarland is pronounced dead, becoming the 5th victim to fall to what is now known to be cyanide poisoning. However, the investigation has taken a major step forward. Now we know what the cause of death is and that it is coming from Tylenol. Now we just have to get this information out to the public. Of course, they had to consider the legal ramifications of this discovery. Incredibly enough, an attorney from Johnson & Johnson, the parent company of Tylenol, arrives at the hospital and meets with Donahue and a toxicologist, and after an hour and a half, proves that the Tylenol contains cyanide. After this, the attorney agrees the news must be released to the public. At a press conference, Donahue surprisingly does not call for a total recall of the Tylenol, but instead informs people that theirs may be tainted, and it would be best to not take it or dispose of it. But at 3 p.m., Johnson & Johnson announces one of the biggest and most expensive product recalls in history. This cost nearly $100 million and 31 million bottles of Tylenol were recalled. In a time when product recalls were uncommon, this was incredibly well done and funded, and it is perhaps because of this that the Johnson & Johnson company didn't dissolve under the financial burden. Paula Prince, a 35-year-old flight attendant, was the 7th and final victim to be discovered. 2 days later, at 5 p.m. on Friday, she was found in her closet, and in her bathroom was an open bottle of Tylenol. In just 2 days, 7 people would lose their lives to an unknown person poisoning Tylenol with cyanide. Think about the horror of something like this. How often do we just take for granted buying medicine at the store and taking it at the slightest ache or pain? And with such a high level of cyanide, there was really no hope for the victims. No chance that they could get help before heart and brain damage could set in from a lack of oxygen. In a matter of minutes, the lives of dozens were changed forever, and the entire city of Chicago would fall into a panic. After the address, the police department had their officers driving around the entire city all throughout the day and night, advising citizens over their loudspeakers to throw away their Tylenol and not take any of it.
Contaminated Tylenol has been responsible for 3 deaths in the Arlington Heights area. Do not take Tylenol until further notice.
Arlington Heights police demonstrated tonight how they have been warning residents throughout the day. And in Chicago, police notified all officers of the threat.
This product may be contaminated with cyanide and should be destroyed.
The first death yesterday morning was in Elk Grove Village, a 12-year-old girl, Mary Kellerman. And then in Arlington Heights, the deaths of 2 brothers and the critical illness of one of their wives. Now tonight, a 4th death in the DuPage County town of Winfield has been linked to the altered medicine. And in Downers Grove, still another death suspected of being cyanide poisoning.
So let's talk about the subsequent investigation. How do you even begin to investigate something like this? Well, the police would work hand in hand with Johnson & Johnson, and it was eventually determined that the cyanide had not been added to the pills from the factory, as if they had been, the pills likely would have been damaged by the cyanide over a period of time. Since the pills still appeared to be in good condition, police believed that they had to have been poisoned at the stores. A check of the victim's bottles showed that the pills had been purchased from several different stores all around the area. So then, the suspect was considered to either be an employee or a regular citizen, as anyone could just enter a store, open a bottle of Tylenol, and poison it. Even back then, surveillance cameras were in use, but not to the same extent we have today. For instance, in stores like Target or Costco, we can track you down each and every aisle, and there are virtually no blind spots, so it's very easy to track shoplifters. But in the 80s, you were lucky if a store had more than one camera at a register. In the case of Paula Prince, police were able to get a video of her buying the Tylenol, and say that they would suspect a bearded man in the footage seen near her, who police would later say they believed to be James Lewis. Several months after the deaths, the FBI would ask a Chicago Tribune columnist, Bob Green, to publish a story about Mary Kellerman, with the address of the home and grave of Mary. The belief was that the killer would come and visit either the home or the grave, which would be under 24-hour surveillance. After several months of this surveillance, and with no one showing up, the operation would be canceled. But just 1 week after the deaths, there would be a huge break in the case. A handwritten letter was sent to Johnson & Johnson that read as follows. Gentlemen, as you can see, it is easy to place cyanide, both potassium and sodium, into capsules sitting on store shelves. And since that cyanide is inside the gelatin, it is easy to get buyers to swallow the bitter pill. Another beauty is that the cyanide operates quickly. It takes so very little, and there will be no time to take countermeasures. If you don't mind the publicity of these little capsules, then do nothing. So far, I have spent less than $50, and it takes me less than 10 minutes per bottle. If you want to stop the killing, then wire $1 million to bank account B449597 at Continental Illinois Bank in Chicago, Illinois. Don't attempt to involve the FBI or local Chicago authorities with this later. A couple of phone calls by me will undo anything you can possibly do. This letter would quickly lead to the arrest of who is still considered the primary suspect in this case, James William Lewis, also known as Jim Lewis. In order to paint a better picture of Lewis, let's take a look at his background. Lewis was born in Memphis, Tennessee on August 9, 1946. He was described as an accountant and had a shocking criminal history. As a matter of fact, just 4 years before the Tylenol murders, Lewis was arrested in 1978 for the murder of Raymond West. But Lewis also had quite a troubled upbringing before ever meeting Raymond West. Lewis was abandoned at an early age by his parents and taken in by foster parents Floyd and Charlotte Lewis. He grew up in poverty and was a disturbed young child, apparently getting so out of hand that his foster mother would attempt to give him back to Child Protective Services. CPS, however, would refuse to take him back. At the age of 19, Lewis reportedly chased his mother with an axe and was charged with assaulting his stepfather, breaking several ribs and a beating. Lewis, later in his life, would overdose on 36 Anacin tablets and was committed to a Missouri State Mental Hospital in 1966 with a diagnosis of catatonic schizophrenia. He would later in his life try to explain the suicide attempt and violence against his parents as a way to avoid the Vietnam draft. On Thanksgiving Day of 1968, Lewis would marry a woman named Leanne Miller, and they would open an accounting business together. One day, they would meet Raymond West, an elderly retired truck driver who would befriend Lewis. On Sunday, July 23, 1978, Raymond West went about his usual business, visiting a local florist and calling a friend in the evening to talk about his broken refrigerator. A longtime friend, Charles Banker, became concerned on Monday when he couldn't reach West by phone. Banker and his wife drove over to West's home to investigate. The couple found the doors locked and West's car in the garage, but their knocks went unanswered. A bedroom shade was raised, and they saw Raymond's bed unmade. They called police. The police would check the house and find all the doors and windows locked, with nothing unusual seen. Charles would tell officers about Raymond's usual contacts, including the local taxman, Jim Lewis. The officer on scene would call Lewis, who told him that Raymond had gone on a trip to the Ozarks for 4 days with his girlfriend. Charles, however, who knew Raymond better than anybody, found this suspicious, as Raymond had never had a girlfriend during their 30-year friendship, and he never went anywhere significant without telling him. Charles made the right decision to report Raymond as a missing person that day. Charles would return to the house on August 14th, growing more and more concerned about his friend, who still had not returned. Upon entering the home again, he was greeted with a horrible smell, and found dried blood on Raymond's bedsheets. After the police searched for a third time, they noticed a foot-long stain running between the ceiling and the wall in the attic. Upon entering, they found a badly decomposing body. Both legs were cut off, and the body was partially wrapped in plastic. Due to the advanced level of decomposition, the medical examiner had a hard time identifying the body, and even after identification was made, they were not able to determine a cause of death. An investigation into Raymond's affairs revealed an interesting thing: a check for $5,000 taken from his account. It was dated July 23, 1978, the day of his disappearance, and made out to Jim Lewis. Lewis was arrested, and a search of his car revealed an entire book of Raymond's checks. But during the trial, the prosecutor was forced to dismiss the case. The judge ruled the police had not had probable cause for his arrest, and they had not read Lewis his Miranda warnings. The prosecution had nothing, and Lewis was released. A decade later, Lewis's fingerprints would be found on a pulley used to raise Raymond's body into the attic, but prosecutors for some reason would refuse to reopen the case. Now that we have a background on Lewis and the type of person he was accused of being, let's get back into the investigation. Lewis would become a suspect after police tracked a letter back to him, as it was linked to an account his wife had access through to an employer, as we noted above. Lewis was arrested and when interviewed by police, told them he had not done it, but then began to give his account on how he thinks the killer could have done it. Lewis gives an entire account, claiming that if he were to have done it, he would have bought the Tylenol, introduced the cyanide, and returned them to the shelves. Lewis was found to possess a book on poisoning, with his fingerprints being found on the pages regarding cyanide. Lewis denied being involved in the deaths, and admitted that he was responsible for the letter, which he stated in court and to the police that he worked on for 3 days before posting. He would be convicted of just extortion, as police could not prove that he had been behind the poisonings. Fast forward to 2007. A continuing investigation revealed that Lewis had postmarked his letter October 1st, 1982. Given his self-admitted 3-day timeline, it means that Lewis would have started writing the letters prior to the first news reports, well before anyone but the killer could have possibly known about it. Incredibly enough, despite this proving he had foreknowledge of the incident, he was allowed to recant and change the story, and authorities, for some reason, decided it would not make a strong enough case against him to prosecute him. Something to remember about this in the legal system, especially in high-profile cases. While obviously the public is pressuring the police and prosecutors to find the killer, they are often hesitant to unless they have a good case against them. This is because if you try to prosecute someone for a crime, and it gets dismissed due to a lack of evidence, you eliminate ever being able to prosecute them again, even if new damning evidence shows up. That being said, if this postmark was proven and could hold up in court, I do wonder why they wouldn't go forward with it, as it shows he knew about the poisonings before anyone could have. In 2009, the U.S. Department of Justice completed a lengthy investigation of the case, concluding that Lewis was the one responsible for the murders, but that there was not enough evidence to charge him. Lewis spent the remainder of his life denying his involvement in the case, until he passed away on July 9, 2023, at 76 years old. Now, there was a second suspect in this case early on, a man named Roger Arnold. Arnold was a dock worker who had been reported to police by a bartender, Marty Sinclair. Marty, whose bar Arnold was a frequent customer of, claimed that Arnold had been going through a bad divorce and become increasingly erratic. Marty told police that Arnold had made claims of wanting to poison people with a white powder. Arnold also worked with Mary Reiner's father. A copy of a book called The Poor Man's James Bond was found in his home, and this book contained information on how to make potassium cyanide. Despite being detained by police multiple times, Arnold was never arrested. However, he would soon discover it was Marty Sinclair who had given his name to police. In an act of revenge, Arnold shot who he thought was Marty leaving the bar. However, he was mistaken, and instead shot a completely innocent John Stanisha, a father of 3 who had been at the bar with friends. In January of 1984, Arnold was convicted of second-degree murder and given 30 years, of which he would only serve 15. That's right, in the eyes of the justice system, John's life was only worth 15 years of Arnold's. Arnold would pass away in 2008. Around this time, DNA was gathered from Arnold's body and Lewis and compared to DNA found on the Tylenol bottles, but neither one matched. The investigators to this day have not given up their pursuit of the culprit, but the investigation is still ongoing. They even gathered a DNA sample from the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, as he was active in the Chicago area and would stay at his parents' house there occasionally. His DNA also did not match.
Did you commit the Tylenol murders?
I did not.
Do you know who did?
I do not know who did, no.
What do you want to say to the people of Chicago, and to the country for that matter? How should they look upon James Lewis? How should they view you today?
I think that is something that you're going to have to take a while to look at. I've been subjected to an awful lot of statements in the press by government and a lot of other people. It is very, very difficult to overcome that much in the way of hostile statements. I have been the officially designated evil one by the Justice Department. When one gains that status, if there is such a thing as a status, it's a horrible status to have.
Decide for yourselves whether you guys think he's innocent or guilty, and leave it in the comments. Unfortunately, once the news of this spread, there were reportedly hundreds of copycat attacks using Tylenol and other over-the-counter medications. In 1986, 3 more people would die from tampered gel capsules. Here, we'll go into a couple of the notable examples. On February 4th, 1986, 23-year-old Diane Ellsroth died after ingesting cyanide-laced Tylenol. The case remains unsolved to this day. On December 9th, 1987, Stella Nichol was charged with the murder of her husband and a banker, Bruce Nichol and Susan Snow, after they were both pronounced dead from cyanide-laced Excedrin. In 1991, Stanley McCorder and Kathleen Denecker would lose their lives after ingesting cyanide-laced Sudafed pills. Another woman, Jennifer Miling, would fall into a coma after ingesting the same pills, but would thankfully recover. Jennifer's husband, Joseph, was convicted on 2 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder in the case, and is currently serving life in prison. In several other instances, there were people who were found dead in their apartments with an open bottle of some form of medication who had died of cyanide poisoning, but for some reason, these were ruled suicides. The victims of the original Chicago poisonings never did get justice in this lifetime, and likely never will. With the 2, and really only suspects now deceased, it is unlikely a new lead will develop, and even if it does, even less likely that the suspect will be alive long enough to be prosecuted. While we all have a fear of a typical serial killer, there are more well-known threats, and all of us tend to think we have a degree of control if we would ever encounter one. But these murders sent a wave of panic through the entire nation. The killer attacked us in a way that most people never considered, an area considered sacred and safe. What some would consider the perfect murder, a poison pill that the victim takes themselves. If not for the mass volume of victims in such a short window, especially the Janus family, it may have taken much longer to figure out what was killing people. And who knows how many more would have died in that case. But what do you guys think? Was Lewis responsible for the killings, or was it Arnold? Or maybe the killer is still out there, having really committed the perfect murders. Well, that's all for today's video, guys. I hope you all really enjoyed it, even with such a depressing topic. I've been wanting to cover this case for a while, and I hope it was informative. If you guys have any questions or suggestions, go ahead and leave them in the comments. And if you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Can't wait to see you guys next Wednesday with our next video. And as always, stay safe and stay tuned.